Lawyers of Reddit, what was your oh shoot moment in court? Story 1. Sat in on a personal injury case where the plaintiff broke their leg in an accident and had a doctor on the stand as an expert. The woman's lawyer begins questioning the doctor about their experience with leg injuries. He was a well-known orthopedic surgeon in the area. She asks if he's ever treated a tibia fracture. The leg bones are tibia and fibula, to which he only answers no. Then she starts grilling him with questions about the tabula. After about 6 to 7 questions, she asks, how did you get a medical license and have been able to practice medicine this long if you've never treated a tibia fracture? And begins a small rant about going after his credentials and those that gave it to him, to which he simply responds, there is no bone named the tabula. The lawyer became beet red, and everyone in the room tried their best to keep from laughing, including the judge. Story 2. I was representing a plaintiff in a hit-and-run case. Plaintiff is testifying and is, despite me preparing them for several hours the previous day, an absolutely terrible witness for her own case. Like, she couldn't even identify the street she was crossing when she was hit by the car. It was a major highway, and we had gone through the sequence of events countless times the day before the hearing. The oh shoot moment came during cross-examination. Defense counsel pulls out a picture of my client dressed up and ready to hit the club, which was posted to Facebook the day after the alleged accident. I, thinking quickly, object, because the timestamp refers to when it was posted, not when it was taken. Defense counsel showed the picture to my client and asked her when the picture was taken. Sure enough, they say it was taken the day after the accident, when she was supposedly in unbearable pain. Oh, shoot. Story 3. When I was in college, I was a bailiff. Guy is on trial for takedown. First witness testified that she saw the defendant shoot the victim. Second witness states the same. Police officer testimony is that he arrived at the scene and defendant was there holding the gun. Coroner testimony is that the first bullet hit the victim in the arm, the second bullet hit the victim in the torso, and the third bullet hit the victim in the heart, which was the fatal shot. Defendant yells out, "See, that proves that I didn't eliminate him. I only shot the motherfudge twice." Story 4. I was a baby lawyer in my first year representing the 19-year-old child of some rich people in San Mateo County, CA. My client had gone on a bit of a shoplifting spree, and we were cleaning all her cases up with a global plea, meaning we handled them all at once. Being new, I filled out the plea form wrong, swapping the counts she was charged with for the counts she was pleading to. It's an easy mistake to make. Every court has their own unique form, and I was unfamiliar with San Mateos. The judge calls my line, starts reading off the plea form, notices the mistake, and then starts screaming at the top of his lungs, "Counsel, what is this? What is this? Is this your first day on the job? This is a court of law, and we do not accept mistakes. Fill this plea form, owe it correctly, or I will have you taken into custody for contempt." I did not expect a reaction like that. My client, who had clearly just taken a huge bong rip at 8 a.m. and who was wearing an all-pink velvet tracksuit, was looking at me like I was the biggest idiot in the world. I corrected the plea form. The judge made me wait until the very end of the calendar to take my plea. Afterward, he called me up to the bench. In private, he told me, "Sorry to ream you like that. Everyone messes the plea form up, so I always pick the youngest lawyer to yell at. The older guys will grumble and complain, but if you noticed, they all fixed their own forms, and we didn't have any more problems." Keeps the calendar running smooth. Where did you go to law school? After that, he invited me into his office for coffee and gave me some really good life work advice. Turns out he likes talking to new lawyers. Teodalter. Judge losses his shoot in court over a simple mistake. Turns out it was all a show for the other lawyers, and I have one of the best court experiences of my early career. Story 5. Represented a woman charged with multiple very serious felonies. She insisted that in the months before the offense, she'd been seriously dating one of the detectives who ultimately wound up investigating and testifying in her case. For a variety of reasons, I trusted this client and believed her, even though the detective never disclosed the relationship in his report. So during his testimony, I asked Detective Smith, "You had a romantic relationship with Ms. Defendant, correct?" He goes, "What?" "No," and is visibly offended. The judge looks at me like I've lost my mind. The Commonwealth attorney audibly says, "What?" I'm freaking out because a large part of my cross and argument was focused on the bias formed by the prior relationship. And now I've got nothing and I've lost all credibility. I try again, Detective Smith. "Have you had an intimacy relationship with Ms. Defendant?" As the Commonwealth rises to object and the judge starts to scold me, the detective goes, "Oh, yay, we've had intimacy. It just wasn't very romantic." Edit update, state is Virginia. The jury acquitted my client of the relatively minor charge that the detective in my story was involved with, but convicted of the other, much more serious charges that detective had nothing to do with. There was a confession and video on the serious charges, so it was kind of a no-brainer. Sorry, I'm being kind of intentionally vague. There are no confidentiality concerns since this all happened in open court, but it's distasteful to give out too much information about a client. The detective was not disqualified. His testimony was not thrown out. Impeachment, no matter how good, doesn't result in you getting to throw out a witness's testimony entirely. By the way, it wasn't really the intimacy that was the issue. It was that he didn't disclose it to anyone, and his repeated insistence under questioning that he didn't disclose it because it was irrelevant. Like Watergate, it's not the crime, it's the cover-up that gets you. But I don't get to demand the judge throw out the testimony or that charge just because the cop failed to disclose a prior relationship with the defendant. I just get to point it out, argue it in closing, and then hope the jury also sees the relevance. Story 6. UK, bear with me on this one. I was in court listening to the most boring old defense lawyer you've ever seen. He was questioning the arresting officer in the case. It was substances or something like that. Anyway, he's droning on about every little detail, and the magistrate was constantly telling him to hurry along. The arresting officer was getting noticeably annoyed, and the room became empty pretty quick. Everyone was very bored and annoyed. He was droning about details that I'm not sure anyone was really listening to or cared about. Anyway, he went over arrest times and the likes with the officer, time he admitted the suspect and released him. He had bored the officer to the point where he was barely paying attention. So he was admitted in at 21:45 on the night in question? Yes, and released the night after. Yes, and that was what? Just after 10 p.m.? Yes, what time after 10? I don't know, 10:15 maybe. So my client was detained for more than 24 hours. Wait, the penny dropped. The officer let his guard down and had revealed he kept the defendant for more than 24 hours, which is the max time for detention in the UK. The defense rested and the magistrate threw the case out immediately. Well played, sir. Well played. Story 7. I think this qualifies. Though it wasn't me that was the lawyer, got called for jury duty, was at the jury selection phase, and they asked if anyone here thinks they should not blah blah. Defendant was in the room. I raised my hand. The defending lawyer looked at me like, oh, this ought to be good, and asked me to explain. I suggested I tell them in private. He insisted I tell the courtroom. I said, okay, I probably shouldn't be on this jury because I was on a previous jury for this man, which returned a guilty verdict. Lawyer's face went, oh, shoot. Commotion and a wait while they looked up records. Yep, verified. Whole jury was now tainted. Everyone goes home, and they start over. Story 8. I was interning for a judge. We were in the middle of voir dire for what was frankly not that exciting of a criminal case. Half-day trial expected, not salacious details or violence or anything. 75 potential jurors in the room, and when my judge didn't let a guy out of jury duty because he'd have to pick up his kids, that guy proceeded to say in front of everyone that if he was made to show up next week, he'd make it the shortest trial ever and find him guilty right out of the gate. My judge was an incredibly even-keel guy. Nothing shook him or got a rise out of him, and he was an expert at figuring out what he wanted to say in the most neutral fashion possible before he said it. Conversations with him took forever because there was a pause before every sentence. But then, this guy poisons an entire jury pool of 75 people. We had to individually question each person to see if that little outburst was going to affect their impartiality, etc. 75 in-camera interviews later, judge pulls the guy back in front of everybody and begins to scream at him about disrespecting him, the courts, and every other juror's time. Me, the attorneys, and the court reporter go white-faced because we didn't know this was coming. The guy didn't have to sit for jury duty, but I still don't know if he got to pick his kids up since he spent a couple days in jail for contempt. Story 9. I was involved in a pretty messy custody case. The other party was a mess and had kept the child from my client for a few weeks. OP was playing lots of stupid games and kept requesting continuances. I requested a substances test, which the judge ordered. However, the OP didn't show up for it. To clarify, he did show up. He just stood in front of the toilet for literally 2 hours and claimed he couldn't pee. I was representing the plaintiff, so the burden was on me. I called multiple witnesses that testified to the defendant's substances use. So, opposing counsel decides to call their client for direct examination and asks, "You don't use heroin and crack, right?" That is, for the non-lawyers, a very stupid question for many reasons, especially considering his client didn't show up for his substances test. However, I fully expected the defendant to just lie and say he was clean. After the question was asked, there was a really long pause, and the defendant said, "Yes, I do both of those substances." My head almost exploded. I didn't ask any questions on cross-examination because I didn't want to muddy the waters. I won, and the child is doing great. Story 10. Not mine, but my boss's won. She had to defend a small-time delinquent as duty solicitor. Before going to court, he asked her what he should do. She explained to him if he was cooperative and truthful, his sentence would be milder. After hearing the case, the judge asked him if he wanted to add something. He got up and explained to the judge, "My counsel told me to be truthful, so I wanted to tell you that I not only did the robbery I'm being heard for, but also several others in the region." He continued to admit to several robberies that had been unsolved yet, and everyone, even the state attorney, were facepalming. Story 11. Mine actually happened while I was sitting in the jury pool during V or Dyer. The case was a double homicide, and the jury pool filled the entire courtroom. If you're not familiar with V or Dyer, it is when the lawyers ask the potential jurors questions to determine who they want to sit on the jury and who they want to exclude. It is a long and boring process for almost everyone involved, but 9/10 it's the most important stage in a case. So the lawyers are asking us questions, and if that question applied to you, you raised your hand and they handed you a microphone to answer the question. The question asked was, do you or anyone you know have prior knowledge of this case? So this older gentleman raised his hand, is handed the mic, and proceeds to say, "Yeah, I work at the police station as a janitor, and I heard 2 detectives talking about him," points to defendant, "and they were saying he was about as guilty as sin." We all kind of stared open-mouthed at this guy, and I started chuckling because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Naturally, the defense attorney asked to approach the bench, followed quickly, though, by the state prosecutor. After some quick and energetic whispering, the judge addressed the man. "Do you realize what you just did? You potentially poisoned this entire jury pool. I will be calling your boss, and you will be hearing about this. You can count on that. You are dismissed, sir, but this isn't over." The man was escorted out, and then the judge addressed the remaining jury pool, which was still in a mostly packed room. Now I want you all to disregard what that man just said. I'm sure if any of you were ever accused of a crime like this, you would want a fair trial and not be condemned based on the words of one old man. I have been in court many times since, but never have I seen that level of downright jaw-dropping absurdity again. Story 12. Literally the first thing I ever did was just a law student intern. Guy has a legit defense on a substances possession case. Substances found in a jacket. Guy wasn't wearing jacket. They were going to have a very difficult time proving the jacket belonged to my guy. Had a long meeting with client. Explained everything. Client was excited. Day of the preliminary hearing, guy shows up and sits down directly in front of the officer who arrested him while wearing the jacket in question, the exact same jacket we were going to say they couldn't prove belonged to him. Story 13. Not in court, but at a tribunal. And also I was plaintiff, suing for wrongful termination. My rep. "So you terminated him because he was ill, employer?" "Yes, mister. And he was ill because he's disabled, employer." "Yes, mister. So you fired someone for being disabled, employer?" "Yes." Edit, formatting in a word. Story 14. Was in court for a directions hearing. The judge was already in a bad mood and asked why we were here for such a seemingly pointless litigation. Without giving details, he was right. The barrister starts to make our case, and I am taking notes about areas we need to further explore when I hear, "Excuse me, why were you so rude to me?" The client, who had been told to not come, had come to court that day and was evidently incensed by the judge questioning the merit of their case. They berated the judge for about 3 minutes, with me and my co-counsel first stunned and then trying to shut them up before he adjourned the hearing. The case did not go very well, to my client's surprise and fury. Big sigh. Story 15. Not me, but my former law partner. She was in court representing a client, I think in a hearing for a restraining order against her soon-to-be ex-husband. Our client was telling the judge that when they met to exchange the children for visitation, the ex had kicked her. He immediately angrily shouted, "She can't prove it. I didn't leave a mark." "Thanks, buddy." Story 16. Probably the funniest one I ever came across happened to a colleague. We were prosecutors then. 18-year-old defendant applying for bail. He needed a residential address and got his dad to show up at court to confirm that the family home was available to him. Defense lawyer gets old dad to confirm that son can stay at family home. Dad says yes. My fellow prosecutor gets up and asks Dad, "Do you really want him home?" Dad goes off the deep end. Jesus, the grief he's brought me and his mother. Out all hours, taking substances, hiding stolen property in the garage. All-night parties, on antidepressants, and the wife's had a nervous breakdown. Dad goes off on one for 5 solid minutes. As the defendant gets taken back to the cells, he calls out, "Thanks, Dad. I owe you one." Story 17. 2 moments in a DUI trial. 1. Passenger is testifying for driver sobriety when the DA asks her, "You keep saying he was sober, but are you even tips certified?" Of course, for bartenders, so they can recognize tipsy patrons. She was. 2. The head of the county's blood lab accidentally admitted he cranked the sensitivity of his machines way up because he was experimenting. Story 18. Obligatory INOL, but in a pre-mediation meeting once for an uninsured motorist claim, an insured had alleged that she couldn't walk without the aid of a cane and had a pronounced limp after an accident due to a low back injury and a shooting pain in her right leg. The doctor notes didn't support anything but a subjective injury after a few weeks, but she was still treating 2 years later and going to new physicians. So we had her followed covertly to see if she was really using the cane and had a limp, etc. We got footage of her carrying like 4 grocery bags in each arm to her car in a Walmart parking lot, walking perfectly fine. When she got to her car, she even opened the trunk of her SUV without putting any bags down and lifted the gate with her knee part way. Her elderly mother was with her using a particularly decorative purple cane with a flower pattern on it. They followed her to a doctor appointment an hour later, and she's on video using her mother's cane and walking with a limp that would give Forrest Gump a run for his money. Never did follow up on how that played in the mediation, but I can only imagine it gave some attorney an "oh shoot" moment. Story 19. Not a lawyer, but a defendant. As a teenager, I got busted with a couple of buddies throwing eggs at cars. We were only actually in the courtroom for our sentencing. There was no trial. The judge called each of us up individually to ask us if we had anything to say. One of my friends tells the judge that he is a good kid who doesn't normally do things like this. Lie, we used to do it all the time. And that I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I wish there was a video of my other friend and I sitting in the benches watching this happen. We simultaneously dropped our heads into our hands because we couldn't believe that idiot just said that. The judge was not pleased, and she took the opportunity to remind him that going to a store, buying eggs, going to another location across town, and then throwing those eggs at cars was not just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Story 20. Late to the party here, but as a law student, we were allowed to make court appearances under the supervision of an assistant district attorney. I was doing arraignments, and my ADA said, don't talk to the judge unless he asks you a specific question. So the judge and the defense attorney were going back and forth about when the next court date would be. The judge wanted a specific date, let's say 420. The defense attorney was adamant that she couldn't do that date. In my file, I had a calendar with a big X over 420 saying, do not schedule. The judge and defense attorney go back and forth for several minutes. The judge wanted 420 and the defense attorney saying no. I was keeping my mouth shut because the judge hadn't asked me directly. Finally, the defense attorney relents and agrees to 420. The judge turns to me and says, do the people agree with 420? At which point I say, sorry, Your Honor, but we cannot schedule for 420. The judge looked at me for a second and then just ripped into me. Mr. Jones-Juan, you just heard me and the defense go back and forth for several minutes about a date you knew the people couldn't do. Do you like wasting the court's time? It went on like that for a few minutes, him just berating me in front of about 200 people in a court in Brooklyn. Finally, after me apologizing profusely and him giving me a withering glare, we moved on and went to the next case. At the next break, the judge said, Mr. Jones, please approach the bench. I thought I was really in for it then. I walked up beside the bench. The judge came down to talk to me and said with a big smile, don't worry about it. I was just giving you a hard time. Welcome to Brooklyn Criminal Court. Story 21. I'm not a lawyer, but I was a character witness for my childhood dog in a civil trial between our neighbors and my parents. Opposing counsel was questioning me. I wasn't even out of elementary school at the time, and he asked if our dog was aggressive. She was a Rottweiler and very loving and incredibly protective of me and my siblings. His final question to me is one I will never forget. He asked, did your father tell you what to say before you came into court today? I responded, yes. Then he asked, what did he tell you to say? I said the truth. Now I was too young to remember the courtroom reaction, but according to my father, the judge audibly guffawed and the opposing counsel lost all the wind out of his sails. Story 22. I was at a hearing arguing that my client was wrongfully terminated because the employer failed to abide by the proper procedures. During the hearing, a witness for the employer tried to offer documents that were fraudulently altered in order to make it look like the proper procedure was followed. I noticed the alteration. Opposing counsel quickly got that witness out of the room, and after a quick adjournment, my client got a large settlement. Story 23. Opposing counsel was a nightmare. Everything late, his work was extremely subpar and so forth. Accused me of lying multiple times when he had dropped the ball. During another hearing in which he did another dumb move, judge says, "I'm glad you are the last case on the call, and all of the other attorneys have left the room, so they aren't here to hear me say that you are a terrible attorney." Answer: I cover courts for a local paper, so I see a lot of cases. There are only two really bad lawyers I've seen that stand out, and one was almost exactly as you described. He would constantly get things wrong, and then accuse the prosecutor of mixing things up to confuse the jury or whatever. I swear he appeared to be asleep at one point. Maybe his case was so bad he was angling for poor assistance of counsel, who knows? But both were so terrible that I was shocked by A, their ages, as they had to have been doing it for some time, and B, their fudgegall. Like both were just so brazen in court that it bordered on contempt. Story 24. I'm not the lawyer, but it's a classic live TV moment in Quebec. The guy's old. Must be at least 90. He's being sued by his daughters, who accuse him of intimacy assault. This is on live TV on one of Quebec's biggest news network. Translation by U6 Data is better than mine. I'm not guilty. I've never slept with my daughters. I never beat my daughters. I never touched my daughters, except for one time at the cabin. I swear you can probably hear his lawyer face-palming hard. Here is the video in French. Story 25. Not a lawyer, but I had a big oh shoot moment. I was in court for driving while suspended in a county and in front of a judge that were both notorious for putting people who did that in jail. My license wasn't supposed to be suspended. A pencil pusher forgot to press a button or something, and it never got unsuspended after the time was up. I had proof of this, but I was still really nervous. The guy who went up to the judge before me walked to the table where we were supposed to stand, sat down, and put his feet up on the table. The judge asked him what he was doing, and he gave a flippant answer and basically told the judge to get fudge. This seriously pissed the judge off. The judge went off on this guy, and the guy gave everything right back to him, pissing him off more and more. The judge ended up jailing him for contempt and had the bailiff cuff the guy and put him in a chair off to the side to await the marshals who would transport him to the jail. My name gets called. The judge is looking at me like I'm fresh meat and he is a great white shark. I'm already thinking to myself, okay, if this judge puts you in jail, run over and beat the shoot out of the guy that pissed the judge off so badly. He's why you're going to jail. The judge looks down at his paperwork and back at me and says, "You're Mr. My last name?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Yeah, we were talking about you earlier. I'm going to void your arrest and dismiss this case. Your license was supposed to be valid and you shouldn't be here." I let out a huge sigh. The judge asked me if I was okay, and I said I had been a bit worried, especially given the guy that was right before me in line. The judge said, "Don't worry about him. He won't be seeing anything that isn't behind bars for about 90 days, and laughed. Answer: Your story reminded me of an experience I had. I received a ticket in a tiny county in Colorado that is notorious for giving bullshit tickets. The county court offered me the option of attending court via phone, which I graciously accepted. The way court via phone worked is 30 people called into a conference phone line at the same time. The judge then ran through each person on her docket while others listened in. One of the first people called has a laundry list of some pretty serious driving offenses: reckless driving, speeding 30 over the speed limit, failure to maintain lane position, etc. The judge offers him a very generous plea deal of careless driving with a 6-month deferred sentence. Right after the judge presents this extremely lenient offer, this gentleman, who must have been sitting in a restaurant, says, "Yeah, I will have another Miller Lite and a shot of whiskey." There were audible gasps from everyone else on the call. The judge, without missing a beat, says, "Mr. Idiot." The court rescinds its previous plea offer. How would you like to plead to original long list of offenses? Story 26. Watching a hearing when the defendant said, I did stab her, but it was a gentle stabbing." Story 27. Not a lawyer, but shared an oh shoot moment with one. I hit something in the road and had a tire blowout while driving home from MEPS. Hit a concrete divider and wound up rolling my car. No injuries and no other vehicles involved. Received a reckless driving ticket that the officer told me was just procedure and not to be concerned with. Fast forward a month and I'm in court with my lawyer, who plans on pointing out this ticket could prevent my hardship enlistment. He's not expecting it to take more than a minute because the issuing officer and prosecutor are on board. Q group oh shoot moment. I'm fourth on the docket and the judge has just handed out maximum sentences for all 3 prior defendants. People are getting 6 to 12 months, having licenses revoked for little stuff. Prosecutor gets screamed at the instant he opens his mouth. Police officer is told to shut up while answering a question the judge asked. My lawyer is told he's about to be held in contempt. I'm starting to think I'm going to get 3 squares in a cot, just not where I planned on getting them. The judge told me to step forward while shuffling my case paperwork, and my lawyer just gave me a look that said, "I'm so sorry." Case dismissed in the interest of justice. And if any more idiots waste his time with nonsense like this again, everyone is spending the night in county. Answer: I was with a friend where a similar thing happened. I went with him to court as support till his was his first speeding ticket, and he was 17 and hella nervous. We go in, not sure where in the docket the trooper who pulled him over was. We start at 9, room is packed. Wait through lunch, and a few people have left after talking with the judge. Wait most of the afternoon, and there are still a lot of people. Finally, the officer gets called up, and the judge starts thumbing through dockets. He looks around his courtroom, looks at his stack of folders, and goes through a few more. You see, my friend got pulled over for doing 57 and a 55. Apparently, this new cop decided that the law was the law, and he did a lot of 1, 2, 3 mile an hour tickets. The judge finishes the folder perusal and just looks at the officer for a moment. Judge tells everyone who was called in for this officer to stand, and most of the remaining room does. He shakes his head and announces that everyone under 7 mph over is dismissed. He seemed to pick 7 because that would include everyone. He lifts the gavel and points it at the new trooper. And if you ever pull this shoot in my court again, you and me are going to have a much longer talk. Story 28. Medical malpractice defense lawyer here representing hospitals doctors. This was not my oh shoot moment, but plaintiff's oh shoot moment. For context, usually at trial, both plaintiff and defendant will have an expert physician testify as to their opinion to whether the doctor hospital performed everything correctly. I thoroughly researched plaintiff's expert, who was an OB-GYN, baby delivery, and found out he had been suspended a number of times for his own botched deliveries and giving incorrect medical testimony to help plaintiff's cases. During the actual day of trial, turns out he was not licensed to practice medicine independently without supervision from another physician, and he was 1 year into his 3-year suspension. Plaintiff's lawyers had no idea about their own expert's background, and they just sat there with a blank look on their face. Needless to say, during cross-examination, we destroyed his credibility and won at trial. Answer: I had something similar in a tipsy driving trial. The defense lawyer had an expert who had previously worked for the state, at which time he gave prosecution testimony. Some of these cases were appealed, and a co-worker did a search for the expert's name and found some of his state testimony quoted in the court's opinion, which he shared with me. So when the expert testifies that the breathalyzer is a piece of shoot and the only good results come from a blood test, I ask Mr. Expert, did you testify in the case of state version? Mope: Yes, I did. And in that case, did you not say breath and blood results are equally valid? Cough, cough. Yes, I did. No further questions, Mr. Expert. Story 29. I've had a couple. Best one was when I was a youth prosecutor, defense attorney in teen court. The youth defendant was on trial for assault. I asked him what happened, and he said, "My friends told me I wouldn't beat up the Easter Bunny at the mall, so I did." Only time I truly could not control my laughter in court. Another, I was watching a detention hearing in federal court. Only issue is whether the defendant will get to go home until trial. This was an appeal of the court's previous decision that the defendant be held until trial. The third witness was an FBI agent, which, needless to say, is not normal at a detention hearing. The FBI agent testified that some other attorney, not the one representing the defendant at the hearing, had been taking letters from the defendant and sending them to different people for the defendant. Those letters were contracts to have the prosecuting attorney eliminate. The representing attorney withdrew, and the defendant was not released pending trial. One more, I was in traffic court one time, and a sovereign citizen who was acting fairly hostile began approaching the judge's bench. He was arrested at gunpoint, which was pretty wild considering there were 150 or so people in the courtroom. Last one, my first ever civil trial, I was representing the plaintiff, who wanted to evict the defendant from her property for non-payment of rent. After presenting my case, the judge asked the defendant to present his evidence. The defendant replied, The judge said, "Now is your turn to present your case." The defendant said, "I don't understand." The judge leans over the bench and asks, "Why are you here?" The defendant said, "Oh, yeah, right." The defendant then went on a 30-minute tangent about all sorts of things, like how he only parks his car so he can see where he is going when he pulls out, because that was taught when he was in the military. I could have objected, but the more he talked, the more the judge disliked him. After 30 minutes, the judge finally asked, "About the rent?" The defendant says, "Oh yeah, I'm not trying to debate that I didn't pay it. That's how I won my first civil trial."